Cumberland Colchester.
Here. Mr. Speaker, last year an all-party parliamentary committee urged the Prime Minister to promise he wouldn't call an election. In fact, at that time, the Prime Minister himself said he had no interest in calling an election during the pandemic. Canadians were misled. Instead of prioritizing the health and safety of Canadians, he forced an election. This begs the question, why did the Prime Minister jeopardize the health of Canadians to save his own job?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in that election, Canada had an extremely important conversation about how to move forward through this pandemic. And partially because of the clear answers...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt the Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester asked a question, and I'm sure he can't hear the answer with all the shouting going on around him. So I'm just going to ask everyone to tone down so that the Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester can hear the answer. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the last election, Canadians were presented with a very clear choice of moving forward with strong vaccination policies that would ensure Canadians were safe, or the Conservative proposal to not really step up on vaccination, not even ensure that all of their members were vaccinated as MPs, and not the kind of leadership on science they wanted. Canadians made a very clear choice to choose and vote for parties that supported vaccine mandates, and that's exactly what has gotten us through this pandemic to this point, with lower death rates than other countries around the world, despite all the tragedies we have faced.
Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, sadly what we ended up with is seeds of division having been sowed and Canadians suffering. We've suffered financially, socially, morally, mentally, and physically. And according to the Misery Index, we are a very miserable nation.
Shame.
For almost 2 years now, Canadians have borne the yoke of loss, uncertainty, and lack of hope. The backs of Canadians are about to break. Canadians are miserable because of the Prime Minister. We want to know on what date the mandates will end.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once again, we see the Conservatives are willing to twist the facts to their own partisan ends. The reality is, vaccine mandates and the fact that Canadians stepped up to get vaccinated to almost 90% ensured that this pandemic didn't hit as hard here in Canada as elsewhere around the world. We stayed focused on following the science, on promoting public health rules, and Canadians stepped up in their communities. They stepped up for their frontline health workers. They stepped up for each other, and Canada has never been so strong and together as we are now.
L'honorable député de Charbot-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, en novembre dernier.
Mr. Speaker, last November, the Prime Minister said the top priority remains to ensure the safety of Canadians and follow the science. Today, we understand that he didn't base his statement on science. At least 2 of his members have indicated that the Prime Minister's response has been politicized to divide Canadians. More than a dozen developed countries have begun to remove health restrictions, but this Prime Minister wants to control the public. Can the Prime Minister tell this House when he will remove federal COVID-19 restrictions? The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
From
the beginning of the pandemic, all Canadians have wanted to know when it was going to end and when we could go back to what we were doing before. And at every step, we've had to adjust measures. We've had to put forward proposals and programs to help Canadians based on what was happening at the time. With lowering rates of Omicron infection, we will be able to change things happening throughout the country, but we will always be guided by science, by data, and protecting Canadians at every step, as we have done from the very beginning. The Honourable Member for Charbot-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, what we found out yesterday is that under the guise of fighting the pandemic, the Prime Minister has deliberately played with Canadians' mental health, manipulated the public to get votes in the last election, minimized the activities of parliamentarians to prevent them from scrutinizing his cabinet's decisions, and stigmatized any Canadian who had opinions that weren't like his. His strategy was to divide Canadians. Will the Prime Minister finally admit that he used the pandemic for electoral purposes to save his job? The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Monsieur le Président, à chaque
Mr. Speaker, at every step, we have put the health and safety of Canadians above all. That's what we did by following the science. The reality is that the Conservative Party continues to play political games by supporting blockades, by giving support to those who are obstructing our supply chain and blocking the City of Ottawa. They continue to support this illegal protest. When will they finally show leadership themselves and be responsible?
Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Mr. Speaker, 2 Liberal MPs have said that the Prime Minister purposely politicized the pandemic. That means for crass political gain in order to save his own job. The Prime Minister deliberately divided Canadians. We have federal mandates still in effect, stifling industries like travel and tourism, while countries around the world with the same information are finding ways to live with this virus. Speaker, on what date this month will all federal mandates be lifted?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, policy in this country is set by a government that listens to science, that follows data, that doesn't listen to people blockading our streets and blockading our borders. That is not the way to make public policy in this country. It's not the way to bring Canadians together. We're going to stay focused on keeping people alive and safe and healthy and indeed prosperous. But the fact that the Conservative Party continues to refuse to condemn the blockades that are hurting our supply chains, driving up prices, limiting our manufacturers from being able to bring in their parts across the country is a shame on them.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, Saskatchewan and Alberta have announced an end to restrictions. Canada's chief public health advisories calling for normalcy. 2 Liberal MPs have called out their own for divisiveness. Canadians have done everything asked of them for the last 2 years. And while many other countries are offering a plan of hope, the Liberals continue to stifle industries like travel and tourism for little benefit. It seems the Prime Minister has got a little too comfortable with using the force of government rather than trusting Canadians. So, Speaker, on what day this month will all travel advisories be lifted?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the member opposite talks about stifling industries. The reality is the support of the Conservative Party of Canada for people barricading our streets and our border crossings is harming businesses, is harming Canadians who are putting food on the table, is driving up prices, is causing uncertainty, instability, and frustration on top of people who have suffered too much because of this pandemic over the past 2 years. It is time for the Conservative Party to show responsible leadership, to condemn these blockades, and all of us to move forward together.